Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we help our listeners to encounter the love of God and live well in the modern world. I am Dennis Miller.
And I am Christine Reagan.
And so before we get into today's topic, let's just give a little bit of context and a little bit of background, because this topic is an interesting one, but I think it's one that a lot of people struggle with. Christine and I certainly have struggled with it. And it's been a topic that has philosophers and theologians struggling all throughout history. And it's the topic of lying.
And we kind of talked about it in our coffee talk, which I think was maybe an episode or two ago. And I'm not super happy with how I articulated myself in that episode. Because what I would say now, it's not that I would change it, but I would qualify things a bit more. And I think that's what we're going to do today.
And I think too, when we were doing that coffee talk episode, we realized that it was a much deeper question that really kind of deserved its own episode.
Yes.
So this is what we're doing today.
So the question on the coffee talk was, is it ever okay to lie?
And I don't think that was a necessarily good question, because the answer to that is a definitive no. Because,
Correct.
Right, so we'll get into all that in a little bit. But there was a lot of context from that question that had to be edited out because we were all over the place. Because it's a difficult topic. There's
a lot of things to consider.
So we did kind of refine our response to that to make it a little bit more digestible for the listeners, and also so that they could follow the logic of the conversation. So I think we did an okay job there. But this is now our third attempt.
Second attempt.
No, this is our third attempt to address this, because we did record a full episode just 2 days ago.
Not 48 hours ago.
Just 2 days ago. And it was an hour and 20 minutes. And at the end of that episode, Christine and I are looking at each other like, well, this isn't going to be helpful to anybody. We can't air this. And it got contentious at times. I just...
At one point, I said, if you don't put your hand down, I'm going to chop it off. Dennis likes to speak. You think I'm Italian. I like to talk with my hands. You like to assert your own authority. I'm gonna smack it.
So this is try number 3. I think the way that we're going to approach this today, I think, is going to be a little bit more helpful to our listeners, because we want them to understand some of the nuances and maybe kind of formulate an opinion themselves, but to also understand how the church approaches this and some of the challenges that the church's teaching poses for us in terms of moral decision-making and whatnot. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to turn things over to my wonderful co-host who can lead us into this topic. And I'm going to follow your lead today, really, to be honest with you.
Well, let's follow the civilized outline that I have put together.
That's what she has this title to.
And that's what it's called.
The new civilized outline for our episode today.
Yeah. There's going to be no name calling. There's going to be no raised voices. There's going to be no overly passionate arguments. It's funny. I
had to call security to escort me to my car. I was in fear for my life last week.
You know what security is? It's our maintenance man who has a lot of keys. No, so I realized that if it wasn't just you and me going back and forth, I would have obviously been more contained, maybe.
Yeah, so I'm the problem.
I think that, don't get me laughing, I'm going to laugh. I think I would have been a very good attorney. I really do. Like, imagine
I've had people tell me that too.
In a cross-examination.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would be a great debater, because I get too passionate about things, but I would be a vicious attorney. Yeah. And that's what you want. You don't want a timid lawyer in those circumstances.
Yeah,
so,
you can be vicious.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I'm using your words.
That's true.
I'm agreeing with you.
I'm thinking of myself in a court of law. I don't think I was quite that intense a couple days ago.
Okay.
So to talk about lying, we're going to talk about the catechism. We're going to define all kinds of terms, and then we are going to charitably exchange the differences in our opinions. I think
we agree more than we don't, but I think some of our disagreements are nuanced, and we're not budging on either one of those. But
nor should we. I think that
we'll hash that out.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So let's talk about the truth. If we're going to get to lying and is it ever okay to lie, let's talk about the role of the truth in the Christian life. So how important is it? It's incredibly important. I mean, think about who God is. God is truth. He is the foundation for telling the truth. He is the very truth in his own self. It's his very nature. It's his very essence. And the whole purpose of the Christian life is we are called to participate, not just in what God does, but in who he is. And so God doesn't just tell the truth. He is the truth.
Yeah.
The Catechism says this. The Catechism says the Old Testament attests that God is the source of all truth. His word is truth. His law is truth. His faithfulness endures to all generations. Since God is true, the members of his people are called to live in the truth.
And truth is one of those existential things that the human person always longs for. We long for perfect love. We long for perfect beauty. We long for perfect truth.
Like our hearts are made.
We're made for it. And so we immediately recognize it when we don't see it.
Well,
so,
we should. Perhaps,
yeah.
Without sin, we would,
right.
maybe.
So truth is God. God is truth. God is perfect truth.
And
so
what does Jesus have to do with that?
He is God. He's the second person of the Blessed Trinity. He's the way, the truth, and the life. He identifies himself as the truth. And in the Catechism in 2466, it says that in Christ Jesus, the whole of God's truth has been made manifest. So Jesus could say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that that's an important distinction, because when Jesus is speaking in the Gospels, and we've alluded to this in other conversations in our podcast, but when Jesus is speaking in the Gospel, he is speaking as the authority of truth because he is truth. So we can't parse what Jesus says and just kind of say, well, I'm going to believe in that, but I don't believe in this.
Like this is going to be my truth, as
Right.
opposed to maybe the truth.
The truth, right.
When it doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. And we had an episode a couple months ago on what is truth. And so I feel like in that episode, we pretty sufficiently defined what truth is.
Yeah.
But I would, just for the sake of this episode, I would say truth is the fullness of goodness, it's the fullness of beauty, it's the person of Jesus himself, it's the Trinitarian persons themselves. It is what exists in reality.
Yeah.
And there's nothing more true than God himself.
I think when you would say, you would agree that if we act in truth, then we're acting in the image and likeness of who we were created for.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And we were made to be virtuous, and telling the truth is a Christian virtue. The Catechism also says this: truth as uprightness in human action and speech is called truthfulness, sincerity, or candor. Truth or truthfulness is the virtue which consists in showing oneself true in deeds and truthful in words, and guarding against duplicity, dissimulation, and hypocrisy. Christians should strive to be honest, to be sincere, to be trustworthy. I think that's what makes us different from people who don't have a relationship with God, perhaps people who dwell in something else, where we're called to know the truth and then to bear witness to it. And then people should see us as truth tellers. And so when they want to know the truth, they could say, I could go to Dennis and he will tell me the truth because he's a Christian, he's a Catholic. I could go to Christine and she'll do the same thing. And so we have an obligation to come to know the truth. And that is to say, to cultivate a relationship with Jesus and to have a real friendship with him that allows us to bear truth to other people in the world. And that transforms the world.
And so I think in a nice summation, we could say that truth is a person. It's Jesus, it's God, but it's also a virtue because we are called to live in the truth. We're called to speak the truth.
Love one another as I have loved you.
Yes.
So Jesus always fulfilled God's will. As Christians, we're always called to fulfill God's will. And I think that's an important element of the truth that I'm going to touch on later in the episode. Yes, it is to speak what is true, to confirm what exists in reality, but I also think a participation in the truth is to bring about God's will. And I want to put a pin in that until later.
Okay.
Okay.
And having had this debate for like 3 hours already, I know where you're going with this already.
Yeah.
So, but
well, good.
Thanks for setting
you
me
should.
up.
That means you listened. So with all of that said, should Christians lie? No. They shouldn't lie. So what is a lie, Mr. Mueller? Tell us what a lie is.
Well, the Catechism, again, it's paragraph 2482. A lie consists in speaking a falsehood with the intention of deceiving. Later, it expands that a little bit and says lying is the most direct offense against the truth. To lie is to speak or act against the truth in order to lead into error someone who has the right to know. And I'm emphasizing that for a reason. By injuring man's relation to the truth and to his neighbor, a lie offends against the fundamental relation of man and of his word to the Lord.
So not only do we have catechism excerpts about it, not only do we have Jesus as being the fullness of truth and a teller of truth, and he encourages us to do the same if we want to follow in his footsteps, but in the Old Testament, it's established that we don't bear false witness against others. So the catechism, we're not going to just read catechism excerpts to you. We have to do that to have a
just to give you context,
civilized conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. The eighth commandment, this is from the catechism again, 2464. The eighth commandment forbids misrepresenting the truth in our relations with others. This moral prescription flows from the vocation of the holy people to bear witness to their God, who is the truth and wills the truth. Offenses against the truth, like lying, expressed by word or deed, a refusal to commit oneself to moral uprightness. They are fundamental infidelities to God, and in this sense, they undermine the foundations of the covenant.
Right.
All right, so we have a lot of Old Testament images and language there.
And I think it's important too because they talk about word and deed. And I think a lot of times when we think about lying, we're thinking about just an exchange of information, words and everything. But, lying can be done through certain deeds. Like if Christine asks me, like, which direction did Father go? And I'm like, I'm going to send her on a little road trip. And I point in the wrong direction without saying anything. That's a lie. I'm intending to deceive her in order to annoy her. So there's other ways that we can lie through our actions and through our behaviors.
We could also lie through our thoughts too. Do you ever lie to yourself?
Yeah,
Right?
but I mean,
like this hairstyle looks good.
yeah.
Christine should curl her hair again. It looks good. But right, I think we can lie to ourselves about all sorts of things. Oh, this really isn't that bad. Right? I can do this or I can commit this sin and it's not really a sin. I mean, every time we sin, we justify our actions or justify our words, and maybe we just lie to ourselves and say, I'm okay. It's not a big deal, which isn't the truth. That's the connection there.
Right. So, going back to that definition, a lie consists in speaking of a falsehood with the intention of deceiving. For me, that's really the crux of it because, when you're trying to deceive something, sometimes you're trying to either hide the truth, conceal the truth, avoid the truth, or maybe to lead somebody, as it says in the definition, to lead somebody into error. But there are things that I think people would mistakenly think is deception and therefore maybe equate to lying that are not. And so, like some of the things that Christine and I were really hashing out in our last go at this was like comedians and storytelling and all those things. Like from an entertainment standpoint, no one's trying to deceive you. If I'm walking into a comedy show, I'm going in there with the expectation to be entertained. And I know it's going to be play on words. I know that it's going to be some embellished stories. I know that it's going to be like a little bit of a setup and a 1-2 punch, and in order to kind of get the laugh. I'm not sitting there thinking that, oh my gosh, he just deceived me, right? I'm going in there with the idea of this is entertainment. And the same thing like with acting. Like no one's going to sit there and say, man, I didn't know Tom Cruise was this incredible spy. He's not lying when he's acting. So like I'm going into that knowing that it's going to be entertaining. And even like you had kind of thrown out the whole magician thing. But again, like even when you're working with a magic show and everything, there's no deception. I know, everybody knows. You would know that when you're at that show that it's all sleight of hand. That there is some type of misdirection that's being played out in order to create this aha. No one's going to look at Blaine, whatever his name, and says, oh my gosh, sorcery, right? I mean, like he's got sleight of hand. They're tricks. And you go into that show.
Right, it's a trick.
Right, but it's not meant to deceive you. It's meant to entertain you. So that's not lying. There's nothing sinful about that. That is, for me, that is not deception. And I would even say so along the same lines, like when we're telling our children stories about, fairies and unicorns and other mythical things and everything, even if they're believing in these things at a young age, that's not lying. That's storytelling, and it's helping to form their imaginations.
I agree with you. It's storytelling done through what, though?
Not deception, it's storytelling.
But here's the thing, and this is where we go off. Deception is simply to lead somebody away from the truth of things.
Yeah, but I know that it's not true. Like a magic show, I know that it's not true.
And here's the thing. I think for the most part, we would probably agree on those things. I do maintain, though, that for things to be funny in the way that we receive them as being funny is because we have bought into an element of deception, and then the punchline comes in.
This is where we went off the rails,
and
last
that's okay.
time.
So here's the thing. I think we're getting into it too quickly. So my point of view is that I do not believe that the definition, and I say this in all humility, I don't like the catechism definition of lying. I don't think it's enough. I think it's too vague. I think it's probably intentionally vague on their part, but I don't like the definition of, what did we just read? A lie consists of speaking a falsehood with the intention of deceiving. I don't think that you always have an evil motivation when you intend to deceive. I think there are times in which we intend to deceive where it's entirely benign or it's actually in service of something that's good. You emphasized the phrase lying has to do with somebody who has the right to the truth. Can you explain the 1994 and the 1997
Yeah.
edition of this excerpt?
I'm just going to read it again just for the listener's benefit. But lying is the most direct offense against the truth. To lie is to speak or act against the truth in order to lead into error someone who has the right to know the truth. That's the full sentence there in paragraph 2484.
And that was the version that was written in 94.
But the Latin text omits that phrase, someone who has the right to know,
It omits it as of when, though?
as of when they wrote their edition.
97.
Yeah, 97 when
Okay.
they came out with the Latin text. So I think it's important for us to understand that that little phrase there, I think it really makes all the difference in terms of how we define, because one, I think without that caveat for people who have the right to know, I think lying is a much stricter definition. As you said, there's very little wiggle room in any of that. Any type of falsehood with the intent to deceive would be characterized as a lie under that very narrow definition that the Latin text provides. And we have to remember that the Latin text is the official text of the church. And so in our English translation and many other translations, they have added that little phrase, someone who has the right to know. And I believe that quote is coming from one of the church fathers or somebody somewhere along the line. I don't think it's something like a bishop here in the United States said, hey, you know what? Let's just add this, because we want to nuance it a little bit more. When you add that little caveat, then the question really becomes, well, what's going on here? Who has the right to know? And the great example that's used by a lot of people when they talk about this particular type of a scenario is to go with World War II. Gestapo show up at your door. You're German and you're hiding Jews because you're trying to smuggle them out of Germany.
Right.
And they ask you, do you have any Jews in your
Which,
house?
by the way, I maintain is the perfect example of this.
For me to say no in that instance, using the broader definition in the English text, would be permissible and not considered lying, because the Nazis don't have a right to know who's in my house. Like, they don't have the right to know that stuff. But if we go back to the Latin text, I am making a statement, a falsehood, with the intent to deceive the Nazis. And so in the Latin text, it would be considered lying. There's really no wiggle room there.
No.
That's really where the debate is. And because we have these conflicting definitions in catechisms, it perpetuates, I think, this ongoing dialogue, discussion, debate, and arguments over what constitutes a lie and what doesn't.
Yeah.
So that's really what we're
I think
wrestling
that's
with.
I think that's the crux of what we're dealing with. And so I would say that there's absolutely no question as to what you should do in that kind of situation. If I had somebody like that at my door, I would absolutely say, no, I'm not. All for the purpose of saving their life. I think in very serious circumstances, all of this goes out the window. You have to appeal to your own common sense. There is nobody, I believe, in their right mind who would not tell a falsehood. I think there has to absolutely be a distinction between what is lying, which you should never do, and the telling of something that is not true to somebody who does not have the right to know it. That's what I'm calling telling something that's false or telling a falsehood. I don't think every falsehood is a lie.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we kind of got into it. Agree or disagree? At this
No,
point? 48 hours later. Have
well,
you
no, I mean,
repented of your sins?
I would. I even told you in our original discussion that I would do the same thing. But
you think you would be?
I think if I'm looking at the official Latin text, ignoring the English translation, if I'm looking at the original Latin text, I would be lying because I'm speaking a falsehood with the intention of deceiving. I'm not acting where the person who's interacting with me knows that I'm not telling the truth. They're not expecting me to tell the truth, like in a joke or in a magic type thing. So that's where I think that the idea of deception is really, really critical. But when you take a look at that definition, a lie consists in speaking a falsehood. So the lie is dealing with something that is a falsehood. When you're looking at that, there's another condition in there besides deception, and that is falsehood. And I think that this is what you were getting at when we were talking about this before, that not all falsehoods would be lies. All lies are falsehoods, but not all falsehoods are lies. Is that what you're saying?
All lies are falsehoods, not all falsehoods are. Yes. Yep.
Yes, but I knew that that's exactly where you were
Right.
going.
Well, that's sometimes I think, okay, all bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. Like that's what I have to kind of do in my head. Like, all right, yes, I
Right.
didn't say it that way. Right.
Right. So I'm not exactly swayed by that. And this is just me. This is not
Own it,
Dennis.
Dennis.
It's only me. So, take it with a
I
grain
just
of
like to
salt.
point out that Dennis is the only German in the room.
Feel
Can we
free.
just do-
feel free to disagree with me. We really want you as the listener to really think critically about all this stuff. I'm not comfortable with that type of an approach.
And can I ask you that? Are you not comfortable? Why aren't you comfortable?
I'm not comfortable.
Because I'm just telling what I'm hearing is
I'm-
that you are. I think you're uncomfortable with the definitions that have been presented.
No.
And how your
I'm-
your morality is going to relate to that in the real world.
No.
And you're no. Go
No,
ahead.
I mean, I'm very comfortable with the definition in the Latin text. I'm perfectly fine with that. If I was making a statement that was a falsehood with the direct intention of deceiving somebody
To save a life or not.
to save a knife or a lot, I would just consider that a sin. But
Wow.
I think
Yeah.
that that the gravity of that, and again, Christine, we've
No,
talked,
I know.
we've talked about this. Like theologians like Aquinas and Augustine would side with me on this.
Not kind of. They would, and that's kind of the
100%,
problem because
right.
sometimes I think we elevate what Aquinas has
Well,
said.
no,
and
and I'm
Augustine
not
has
elevating.
said.
I'm just saying that there are some pretty.
I think people put it on the same playing field as like divine revelation.
I'm not doing that.
But
I'm not
many
doing
people
that.
do. Like Aquinas said it. It's gospel.
Right.
Aquinas didn't die on the cross. Everybody
Right.
calm down.
I know, I get that. But I think that when you get into that, my fear is, and my worry is that going back to the story of Adam and Eve, we have a tendency in our concupiscence, in our fallen nature, to try to rationalize away our behavior, our sinful behavior, into minimizing it or just what's the word I'm looking for?
To
I
justify.
don't- to
To
justify
justify.
or to alleviate or to absolve ourselves of like, well, this isn't really a sin. I'm not really sinning here. And I think that that can be a very, very slippery slope. And I'm not even probably using that philosophical term in the right way. But I think that
Well,
can,
one thing could lead to another. It makes it easier to sin down the line.
it can. And so
I
that's
wholeheartedly
really,
disagree with.
that's where I'm coming from.
I understand.
That's my concern with a falsehood isn't always a lie.
But I think we say things that are false all the time, right? Now, I think that the comedian and the stage thing, by the way, I don't think those two things are the same. And I don't think it's the best example. What I mean to say is there's plenty of other circumstances where we say something that is not true and we intend for it to be ordered towards their good. And I don't think in any way it's violating St. Paul, who says you may never do evil so good may come of it. If I were to say something that's false to a child, to somebody who is mentally or emotionally compromised, to somebody who I would say does not have a right to the truth, I think that inclusion is absolutely necessary. You're okay with it not being there, right?
I'm okay with it not being there because I just see when we resort to that type of behavior, I think more often than not, it's the easy way out. Rather than doing what is hard or difficult, saying what really needs to be said, I think sometimes, again, in an attempt to make things easier, kind of to avoid certain situations or whatnot, we say, oh, it's okay in this circumstance in order to
So you're
do
saying
that.
if we say it's okay in one circumstance, it has to be okay in all circumstances, and that's not a good thing.
I think that that's where it can lead. I'm not necessarily knowing that we're saying that because I think a moral person like yourself would be able to discriminate between.
I think you have to. I think the art of discrimination here is where you find the good. I don't think there's anything I think for the average person on a daily basis who's not dealing with somebody who is compromised in some way, who doesn't have the right to the truth or is not hiding people in their basement, something like that, I think you're right. I think we should always tell the truth. There's no need for deception. But all too often, these circumstances arise and they need our attention. Something like if somebody is struggling with dementia and they cannot remember that their spouse has died. I don't think they have a right to the truth because of how compromised they are. And I don't think that in any way it's a lie to say something other than, oh, your spouse died. Don't you remember they died?
Right. And so
I think you're deceiving them. 100% it's a deception. 100% you're trying to lead them into error. There's nothing evil about it. There's nothing vengeance oriented or anger or malice. None of that's involved. You simply you're performing some kind of merciful act. They remain calm. They stay in the good. And I think it's an exercise in charity. But in your argument, you're saying it's a venial sin, and a venial sin wounds charity. I think that's, and I say this as calmly as possible, I think it's a dangerous way to think. What are your thoughts?
Well, using that type of an example, with the English translation, it would not be sinful, right? Because you could look at that particular individual who's suffering from dementia, and for all the reasons that you cited, you can justify they really don't have a right to know,
Yeah.
because that knowledge is going to cause them pain, it's going to cause them suffering. And 10 minutes later, if I tell them the truth and they go through all that and I get them all calmed down, 10 minutes later, they're going to ask me the question again, and here we go again. And I think that that's where things kind of get nuanced a little bit, because in the English translation, that's perfectly permissible. Right, that's totally permissible because of that added little clause, someone who has the right to know.
But according to Aquinas and Augustine and John Henry Newman and many other theologians, I would say you have more theologians historically on your side than on my side of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
To me, it's so obviously foolish, if I could say. I think that there's nobody in that moment. Everybody's natural law and common sense would kick in. Say, no, oh, they just went to the store, they'll be back later. And what does that person get to do then? They get to stay in a peaceful state, which I would argue is God's will for their life at that moment. And they would finish their dinner and they would go on with their life, however limited that may be, or how, you don't want to cause people unnecessary pain and suffering.
But
and
is there a way to do that without engaging in a falsehood?
I think so, but not always, not always. And I sometimes think the most obvious and direct response is the right response. You could say,
I think
don't
it's
you
an easy
remember
response.
this? What I'm concerned about with your logic here is that we're thinking about, how do I keep myself from sinning? How do I keep myself from doing that? Whereas you're not thinking about the other person.
No, that's not
my
true.
concern.
I mean,
Because what's
you're
best for
making,
them.
You're making a big assumption
No,
there.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
That's what you are reading
Because you're
into.
trying to get away from, how do I not tell a lie, rather than how can this person exist in a peaceful state?
There's other options.
Okay,
What I'm saying is that
give me
there's
another
other
option.
options.
Give
I
me
mean, if
another
somebody
option.
turns around and says, where is my grandfather, for example, if they were alive and my grandmother was deceased and he has dementia, and he says, where's Midge? Where's Midge at? I mean, if I said, don't worry, Pop, you'll see her later, and he'd be perfectly fine. You probably have to gauge to see what type of response and reaction they would have to make. And maybe there may be some initial upsetment, but eventually you would find a way to kind of tell him where you don't have to resort to falsehoods and you're accomplishing the
lies
same
in your
thing.
definition.
Or lies in order to accomplish the same thing. And
so then do this though. Explain to me how me saying they're at the supermarket, they'll be back later. How is that a venial sin which wounds charity in the heart of man? Tell me.
it would be a venial sin because you're lying. It's
But
the
how
act of
does it
lying.
wound charity? How is it an offense against love?
Well, you have to remember, when you sin, you wound your relationship with God, you wound your relationship with others, and you wound your relationship with yourself. Every sin involves harm to the self. Even if it's a venial sin, there is a wound there. It might just be like a scratch. It might just be like a nick on the soul. It might not even be noticeable, but there's a wound there. I think we deceive ourselves when we think that we can make these type of statements and that there's no real consequence to us because we're saying, well, we're acting with charity. That might be our intent, but that doesn't necessarily make what we're doing right and good. We might be able to justify it. And that's where I kind of get worried about when it comes to this question of falsehoods and everything. Because if we're seeking to maybe justify our behavior and say, well, it can't be a sin because it's not against charity. Well, like, when was the last time you looked at your soul? We don't know the depth of the wound that we create on our soul. We don't see that. We can't measure it. We know mortal sin. We know the effect and the eternal consequences of that. But venial sins, even something that just lacks just a smidge of gravity, is still a wound to the soul. So I might be loving him in that response, but am I loving God when I make that statement and breaking his commandment to not lie? No. All I need is one of those conditions. Myself, that's actually four. It's the church, it's God, it's others, and myself. All I need is to have that infraction affect one of those relationships, and it's sin.
And what I would say is that I just think it's so legalistic.
I don't think it's
Yeah.
legalistic. I think there's just other ways in which to navigate this rather than going for the easy, I'm going to lie, I'm going to say it's a falsehood, and not all falsehoods are lies, and therefore this is okay. This is a morally acceptable choice. That's just me.
Yeah.
That's just me. And I can live with that.
So,
Going back to your
yeah.
your Nazi example,
Yeah.
would I lie in that situation? Yes. Would I know that I was committing a sin in that situation? Yes. And when you get into sinful behavior, it's a deliberate choice, right? It's a willful choice. I don't necessarily know that choice would have gravity to it because of the weight of the situation that is involved. I don't think lying to the Nazis and trying to deceive them when I know that they're going to come into my house and take away people in order to murder them. I think the gravity of my lie in that situation, my moral culpability, is greatly lessened. I would see that as a venial sin. But I would still, like, if I was in another situation, I would have to make a concrete decision as to whether I am going to outwardly lie and deceive someone, or if I am going to try to find an alternative way in order to maybe withhold that truth or to convey the truth maybe in a vague way that
Sure. And sometimes there's an opportunity for
Yeah.
that. And I would say if the opportunity presents itself to have success in what you're trying to achieve for the good, and you can do so through just not saying something or redirecting the truth or maybe offering a half truth, I would say that's a better way to go. I think the way life is incredibly complicated.
I don't disagree.
And sometimes you just have to say the thing that is not true.
I don't believe that. I believe that,
and I know you don't. I know you don't.
My thing is, and I'm go ahead. You
Yeah,
finish
no,
your
no,
statement.
no,
go
no,
ahead.
that's
No,
fine.
no, I'm the one interrupting you now. So
That's
go ahead.
fine.
Finish your statement.
No, I think that even presenting it that way is going to have people unnecessarily call into question their own morality. And I don't think there is any gray area whatsoever when you're talking about life and death. When you're talking about somebody is going to live or die based on what I choose to say. Because think about it. I mean, if you need to offer a direct answer, I want no hesitation in saying no when the answer is really yes. If lives depend on it, I think that the falsehood it's just so obvious. And I don't want to have anywhere in my mental space or conscience having struggling with that choice. Absolutely, the answer is no, to save a life. And I think that we have the obligation to preserve that life always supersedes any other law that exists, truly. And I think that we don't want to compromise what virtue really is by reading the law so rigidly and legalistically that we don't do the obviously good thing that's right in front of us.
I don't think I'm
I know
being,
you don't,
yeah,
but
I don't
I
see
really
it,
do.
I don't see it as being rigid and legalistic at all.
I think to do something that is a work of mercy, where somebody lives based on what it is that I chose to do. I don't think that people I don't think the Nazis don't have a right to truth because of how far they've fallen into sin and evil and darkness
You're right.
themselves.
And I would agree.
And not-
Using the English definition,
Right, but
you're
even
right.
if it's not
There'd be
there,
no hesitancy.
even if it's not there, I think common sense, they don't have a right to truth. I think the natural moral law that's written in your own heart compels you to preserve the life that you are protecting. And there's no ambiguity there.
No.
My heart is not, but
I
there's
agree
also
with
no
you.
sin there.
I
There's
agree.
no sin there because to commit a venial sin is to wound charity. And I don't see how that is part of the equation at all, unless you're reading the text in a legalistic way.
No.
How am I?
I just explained to you how
know,
I see it
know.
as wounding myself, and it's still.
And I would simply say you're wrong.
It would still be an offense against God because
An offense against God to preserve life. To preserve
the
life.
It's
an offense against God to preserve the life that came from the life giver.
I know, but
it's a little bonkers.
We have to be very, very careful because, again, you go back into morality. They're very clear that the ends never justifies the means. So for me, as you're saying, to preserve that life that was given by the Creator, that is the end goal. But to achieve that through lies and deception does not justify doing that.
That's fine, but you can, and you've said that, I don't agree with it. Because I don't think that every deception is a lie. I think we deceive sometimes even on maybe a daily basis. I think we have to look at, like, scripture is real big for me with this. I think that the practical application of this is very plainly seen, like God's will, maybe even through deception, I would say, towards people who do not have the right to know, is obviously seen in examples throughout, particularly the Old Testament. We have what goes on with Abraham and Sarah
Hmm.
in Genesis. We have what happens with Joseph and his brothers. We have what happens between Rahab and the spies, the Israeli spies that she's hiding. She's rewarded for that. I mean, think about what she does. They come to her, they say, do you know where the spies went? And she's put them upstairs and she said, "Oh, I think they went that way." But she knows full well she is not condemned. She is praised. Her family lives. God rewards her. She's thanked by the Israelites for this. And I just think that in the face of tremendous evil, especially, I think that's the most extreme example of it. But it does happen. That's when people say, "Oh, you can't use the Nazi example. You can't use this." Well, it's happened.
I know.
That's why I think absolutely we can and we should, because of just how far the human condition has fallen,
Yeah.
where we've put ourselves in these situations. So I just think that life is so complicated, and we have to do the things that our common sense tells us to do. And listen, if we're in and I'm not just saying common sense in a willy-nilly flagrant fashion. I think you need to be incredibly well-formed and well-versed in the scripture and the person of Jesus. You need to have a real relationship with God to be even able to know when you can and should do this. There's other examples. There's an example from Second Chronicles where God says, "Who will deceive the enemy for me?" And this person is praised and elevated in doing so. I think we see how God acts and responds in these situations. There are times where deception is the absolute moral, good, right thing to do. And it's not a participation in evil whatsoever. And I even think that the suggestion that it could be a venial sin will keep people from doing the virtuous thing. What would you do in the face of your venial sin? You would go to confession, right?
Yeah, I would go to confession.
But anytime you're going to confess a sin, you have to have a resolve to not do it again.
And I would have a resolve to do it. Not if there's an opportunity for me to avoid those type of things, I would. Like, again, going back to the Nazi thing, somebody comes up to my door. I'm not, like you said, I'm not going to have time to really think out like, what is a way that I can maybe say something and still speak the truth. I'm going to lie, but it's a lie. But I think for the listeners, I mean, you can understand why this is such a difficult question to kind of navigate, because we can go back into the Old Testament and we do see passages where it appears as though God is rewarding deceptive and deceitful behavior. And maybe that's where this clause, "who has the right to know," comes in, because when you take a look at these examples, the question is, well, does this person really have a right to know? And so it solves the problem. It solves the problem.
It solves the problem, but I don't even think we need to solve the problem. I think reason alone pretty much solves the problem it solved it for me. I would like it to be there, because then it would make sense to people who are challenged by it, but I'm not challenged by it. And so it would be nice if it was there, but I think my own use of logic and reason and who God is, knowing who God is, it takes care of the problem for me. There is no obstacle I have to understanding if what I'm doing is sinful or not. I do not think it's sinful. Now, that's me talking. I'm not saying that I'm right. I'm saying that this is how my conscience is convicting me about it. And I do wish other people saw that, because to me, it's such an obvious participation in the good. I wish that we defined truth as what would see to God's will and purpose rather than precisely what exists in reality. Because when it comes to the decision between life and death, God's purpose and God's will is most likely always ordered towards life. I mean, Chesterton even says himself, he says that any person, now he does qualify it as a lie, but he said if a child was in danger, anybody would lie to save the life of that child.
Mm-hmm.
I would say anybody would tell a falsehood to save the life of that child.
See? Yeah.
To say that somebody has to do some form of mental gymnastics just to get around the telling of a venial sin, because listen, we're told that sin, regardless of what degree it is, it's
sin.
a sin.
Sin is
and
a sin
I think
is a sin.
that there is no sin in doing something to save a life. I think that makes perfect sense when it comes to the situation with the person with dementia, with maybe some lies we tell children because they're not age appropriate to understand, and what we do with the Nazis at the door. When it comes to be a matter of life and death, the obligation to promote and preserve the sanctity of human life supersedes everything else. And I don't in any way think it's a participation in evil.
Again, going back, I just don't think the ends justify the means. And I don't see falsehoods as being nuanced in the sense that they're not lies. And again, this is just where I'm coming from. And I'm very comfortable with that position too, because any other time I commit any of the other 9 commandments, I'm aware of that sinful behavior. I know that I'm freely choosing to do it. I understand why. And I bring that to confession if I'm truly sorry for what I've done. So the contrition is there, and it's the same thing with lying. So for me,
I think you could look at it as like, it's a shame I had to do this, but I'm not sorry I did it. It's a shame that the world exists in such a state that we're fighting in this battle between good and evil. I think it's complicated. I think it's tricky.
And we've talked about this. You don't need to have regret for what you've done, but you do need to have repentance, which is like, I'm going to try. No,
you need to have sorrow for what you've done. That's
That's contrition, right? The contrition is the turning away. So I am going to try not to do this again. But in my fallen nature, you know that you will. No one ever walks away from confession never having sinned again.
If I lied that I wasn't hiding people in my basement, I would not see a need to go to confession and utter the words, I am heartily sorry for having offended you. What have I done? What have I done?
I don't know, Christine. I think the danger in that is we're presuming a lot. I would rather go to confession and just confess it and just throw that at the mercy of God. And if God says, dude, you're not sinning, but it's nice, I'm glad you brought that to me anyway, then that's fine. That's between me and God. But I'm going in there with a clear conscience. I think when we begin to kind of try to differentiate and nuance our behavior and say, well, this wouldn't be a sin in this condition, it is a sin in this condition, and this is a falsehood, and that's a lie. I think that what we're doing is we're really setting ourselves up for justifying sinful behavior and trying to alleviate the potential to alleviate our conscience, our guilt, when we're actually sinning. And
I think most of the time we do that. I think for the average person, that's true. But in an extraordinary circumstance, which does arise, there have to be ways in which...
You wouldn't take that to confession because you just felt that you didn't commit a sin, you have nothing to confess to God?
I think I know who God is.
Okay.
And I don't think that preserving human life is something that I would have to express sorrow over.
Christine, you're going to an extreme.
No, I'm not going into an extreme. If my demented grandmother, I don't think I would have to go to confession week after week. I don't think I would have to say, oh, I told my grandmother that Pop-Pop was still alive, because it causes her undue suffering and anxiety.
I get it.
I would not, but here's the thing. When I say one thing, you're like, oh, that's too extreme. But then when I bring it back down, the principle applies in the same
But here's the thing. In that particular situation with your grandmother, you have time to think of an alternative way.
I don't have to.
You have time to rethink how to handle that situation. You can talk to other people. You can get consultation. You can say, this is what I'm not really comfortable, telling her that my grandfather's alive. How can I go about doing it? And you can work through, because that's what discernment is. You can sit down and you can discern how best to handle that situation. When somebody is knocking on your door in the Jew example, and they're looking and that there's an immediacy, they're going to come in if you tell the truth, and they're going to kill people, maybe even you don't have the time to think about it. And so maybe lying is that last resort, but it's still a lie.
I don't think it's a lie. Yeah.
Well,
it's a falsehood.
And again, for the people that are listening, I you can see, how this is nuanced, and
we're glimpsing what happened 48 hours prior.
I think after all of this back and forth, I think you can kind of see that this is and again, some of you might agree with me, some of you might agree with Christine. As Christine acknowledged earlier, I think a lot of the teachers and theologians of the early church, the church fathers, take a harder, narrow perspective that would be more in line with the Latin text. But I think that there is room for discussion. I think this is good when we have these type of things, because we need to hash out all of this stuff. It's not always as clear. Sometimes it can be a little nuanced. And I think these conversations are good because if they do anything, I think that they help us to kind of form our conscience. And that's really what the ultimate goal is. We really want to have a formed conscience. So when we're faced with a decision, we can use that gift of right judgment to choose what would be most pleasing to God in this type of a situation. I don't know if any of this is going to be helpful to you, the listeners, and everything, but I'm sure that it's created maybe a stir one way or the other, and maybe it's gotten you to kind of maybe think a little bit more critical about things. But I would say that all of that stuff is good. So,
All right. We'll see you next week.
all right, God bless.